With his victory on Saturday over Eddie Alvarez, Conor McGregor won his second UFC title, meaning that he simultaneously holds the lightweight and the featherweight championships. Now, first and foremost, that should not be possible. He should already have been stripped of his featherweight title for not defending it for a year, for having two fights at a different weight class while other contenders were available within his division, obvious one being Frankie Edgar, and then Jose Aldo came back, and now Jose Aldo actually, thanks to beating Frankie Edgar, now holds the interim belt there. So in a sport which is purely based on competitive integrity and trying to find the best fighters, etc., Conor McGregor should now have just won the lightweight title and given up the featherweight division. But that wasn't going to happen, was it? Because the UFC, in this sense, has more in common with WWE than a pure sport, because the whole concept of the UFC is actually setting up popular fights. Now, sure, it's within the framework of the fact that, sure, in theory, you have to be like a winning fighter and one of the better fighters and one of the, etc., etc. But we do see repeatedly this trend where if you're considered of a boring style or you've been beaten by the champion, then it is harder to get title fights. Meanwhile, if you have an exciting style or a big name or it's a big money fight or the champion would like to fight you and they think it'd make an awesome fight, then you will get quicker title fights. I mean, in this sense, you have to understand that that is the business model of the UFC. It's not like a sport where you just put on the sport and then you hope all the money from viewing rights comes in and broadcast rights. No, this is about selling pay-per-views, not finding out who the best necessarily is. Now, you hope ultimately by having enough fights, you do find out who the best is. But for example, Miesha Tate could never have been the women's champion if Ronda Rousey had remained the champion, because she'd already had two title fights in which she was convincingly beaten, both times finished, and by the same move, so she never would have been allowed a third fight, unless she literally had just beaten, gone on like an 8-fight winning streak, beating every other contender, then maybe they'd have let it happen if they could have also added in some spice to make it like, oh, this has to be the fight, because otherwise people would have considered it a boring pay-per-view to buy. Just as, in the past, when GSP was the champion, there was a period where, let me think, what was his name actually? Let me just double check that. John Fitch, yes. So John Fitch was the contender who was considered by most to be the second best, but because earlier on he'd fought GSP and basically him and GSP had a similar wrestling style and kind of shutting down the opponent and grinding them, he was just outfitched by GSP. And so even though he went on a really good run, and even though he was actually set for a contenders match against, what was his name? This is why you probably shouldn't do videos late at night. Let me think, what was his name? The guy was a kickboxer. Let me see. Thiago Alves, that's it. So, of course, he obviously had, in fact, went on to fight GSP. Even though he was set against him in a contenders match, because Thiago Alves actually missed weight, it ended up not being a title fight. And so even though Fitch won that, the UFC kind of reneged on their promise that he was going to get the shot. He never did, and they just waited long enough until he'd lost enough fights that he no longer was in a position to be the top contender. And in fact, actually, they let him go from the UFC entirely because his style was considered boring, despite the fact within the system of points of how MMA is judged in the UFC, he was a fantastic fighter and was winning many, many fights. It's just he didn't have a big name draw. People didn't in general want to watch his style, and he'd already lost to the champion. So the point when we're setting all of this up is that the UFC clearly does make decisions based on what the biggest money fight at any point in time is. And so since Conor had made way too much money for the UFC already, like he is the biggest fighter in the whole UFC. He transcends the sport of MMA at the moment in terms of how many casuals are willing to come and pay to watch his fights that probably wouldn't otherwise, and as a result, how many bars can be filled with people who just vaguely know about MMA but have heard about this phenomenon of Conor McGregor and want to watch him fight. In that way, he is at the moment very much the Tyson of MMA. And so, because he's made way too much money and all his fights make too much money, they weren't going to allow him to be stripped. What's more, they were clearly going to go with Conor McGregor and pursue that Nate Diaz rematch purely because that was the big money fight, because that's the guy who just beaten him, and it was going to be the same weight, so it was going to set up the perfect movie storyline, right? Then, after he beats Nate Diaz, they still don't want to strip him because they want to follow the two-belt storyline. So rather than let him go down to featherweight and defend and risk losing it, they don't do that. Rather than strip him of it and just have him fight a lightweight with no championship, they don't do that. So they put the super fight together. Remember, there's been very few super fights they've been able to put together in the history of MMA, and the UFC certainly hasn't really managed any champion-on-champion ones with the belts on the line, and therefore they wanted the chance to do this for the huge money fight. So they had Eddie Alvarez there. They put the fight together. I mean, I think they themselves were pissed off that Rafael dos Anjos lost to Ferguson, so they couldn't even find any way to have him fight him first before Eddie Alvarez, but whatever. The Alvarez fight gets put together, And the key thing is, there are some compelling reasons to see why Eddie Alvarez would have a chance. Eddie Alvarez is very durable. He's been in a lot of wars. He has a good motor on him. I mean, you go watch those Michael Chandler fights he had in Bellator. These were wars, and these were really sick fights. Problem is, you look at the fact Eddie Alvarez is quite small for a lightweight. He doesn't have like super knockout boxing. He just has good boxing, and he's like a training partner, Frankie Edgar. He's that type of a fighter. So the problem was for this fight, when you saw it play out, stylistically it was a mismatch. Conor McGregor is too precise. He has a lot more discipline now as a result of the last few fights he's had. And so stylistically, you look at it and it played out the way that actually people who've watched his past fights would have been able to see, which is he has that counter left where you come in, he moves back, he counters with the left, and if he touches you with it, if he hits you on the chin with it, you are going to get damaged. You are going to get put down, and you might even get knocked out depending on who you are. That is combined with the fact that when people go in for it and when he's able to hit this, they nearly always are overextending. So they're already going to lose their balance anyway. And he's hitting them when they're not on top of their stance. So this is a big problem. And this is why that's his signature move. And that's why that's the killer so far. No one really can withstand it a whole lot. Sure, Nate Diaz took some of them, but those weren't really the same ones. It wasn't Conor McGregor moving backwards in that first Nate Diaz fight. It was Conor McGregor reaching forwards to hit it. So different punch entirely, different impact. Because when you're going into a punch, it's different from when you're moving away and it hits you. So I actually still think the interesting thing about Conor McGregor is despite what an incredible run he's had now and how big his name is and how people are going to think if they're casuals, he's the best fighter that ever lived. He isn't actually really. He hasn't got to that status. He still hasn't had that many elite fights. And most interestingly, we still haven't seen him fought what would seem like the correct way to counter him. So there's two ways that would seem the correct way to fight Conor McGregor. Number one is, yes, you need a wrestler who can not get hit by him and can take him down. And we haven't seen that. Sure, Chad Mendes managed it a bit, but then Chad Mendes got lit up on the feet, says fuck all he could do there. Eddie Alvarez didn't fucking wrestle. He tried early on and then it didn't work and he got drawn into this boxing and did the classic move where you fall into Conor McGregor's trap and you get knocked the fuck out. So instead, we need someone who can be a wrestler. Or, if they're going to be a boxer, and it's not like Conor McGregor can't be beaten on the feet, they have to be someone who understands this particular strength he has and therefore fights what is the counter to that. So they need to not overextend, not chase into him. They need to fight him, box with him, but they need to push him back with the double jab or use these sorts of fighting styles where you stay on top of your stance, don't lean forwards, you don't overextend, and therefore either he has to come into you, which was great when we saw when Nate Diaz fight. That's exactly one of the things that made him use up a lot of energy, and he was a lot of that took a lot out of him to do so, and he wasn't having that same knockout power when he did it. Or you've got to wrestle him. It's got to be one of the two. And so far we haven't seen that from anyone. And that's actually not because there isn't anyone in the UFC who can do that. It's because he hasn't had that many fights at the top level. That's how incredible the run that he was on was and how kind of he just lit the public imagination up. So he got to the very top very quickly instead of having all those really good gatekeeper title fights that you would have otherwise. So think of the rest of his career, okay? How he won this fight and the differences between some of the others. So earlier on, like the first decent fighter he really fought, I mean, you can say obviously Max Holloway was very good because Max Holloway himself has got up the UFC rankings. But back then, they were both not big names whatsoever. So when he was against Poirier and when he was against Siva, these were fights where he was like the Alvarez fight. He was very disciplined. He controlled the pace. He chose his shots. He made sure he landed his left, and that's how he won the fight. And he was in no danger in these fights. Against Mendes, he landed as well, and he landed early, so there was no issue. Even though Mendes took him down, even though Mendes initially was doing all right, as long as he got up and was in a position to land those shots, then it was fine. The fight against Aldo, you can't really even judge. It was too short. I mean, it was literally one punch. One real punch was landed and he knocked him out instantly. So I actually think that is the fight that stopped us from seeing who the real Conor McGregor is at the highest possible level with the toughest challenge. Because that should have been his true test. If that's a fight that goes, say, 2 rounds, now we find out a lot about Conor McGregor. Maybe back then that we know now. Instead, it didn't. It was over instantly. And so actually, that was kind of a cock tease. We never really got to find out what Conor McGregor was all about. But as a result, he also never got fully tested by an elite level opponent where he was chasing it himself. He wasn't so disciplined as he was against the lesser guys. So when he had that first fight against Nate, he fell for fool's gold, in my opinion, because he landed some shots early, he thought to himself, I can knock this guy out. I can beat this guy. My boxing's better than this guy. I'm dominating this guy. I've got ring control and I'm going to knock him out. The problem is he didn't think to himself about the history of Nate Diaz. So Nate Diaz is someone with an incredible motor, some of the best stamina we have ever seen in MMA. But Nate Diaz did not have a full training camp coming into this fight. Now, true, him and his brother Nick run triathlons, do all this crazy stuff. That keeps them at a pretty good level of fitness. But still, the special kind of training camps you do for certain opponents is different. The extra amount of exertion you put in that to build your energy tank up to the max. And so you saw Nate Diaz started that first round pretty slow, actually. He started him like he wasn't going at his full speed that you normally see from him. He wasn't at the kind of pace that a Diaz brother is expected to be at. So because he wasn't, and therefore Conor was landing early, Conor started thinking, right, I can knock this guy out. This is done. But that's the problem. Conor McGregor chased the knockout. He punched himself out. He was winging punches. He was putting way too much into it. He wasn't fighting actually with his own strength, which is precision and timing, not speed and power. And he was just chasing that knockout. And as a result, he burned his own energy out. And so Nate Diaz essentially just stuck around, and that's how he won the fight. Nate Diaz isn't going to get put away. He's not just going to get straight knocked out. That's why that Thompson knockout that Diaz had is still one of the most confusing, still a mystery to me that it even happened. That was very shocking when that occurred. I'd love to know if there's anything going on in his personal life there, or if it was just a fluke that he caught him on the right angle. That was a very weird one if you look at Nate Diaz's whole career. So Nate Diaz has stamina for days. This is a guy who has very solid boxing. This is a guy who has very good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You just never get to see it because he boxes and just uses his stamina and never has to worry about people taking him down. So Nate Diaz bided his time, his moment arrived, and then he took over the fight. The fight was turned, and then he won the fight. Now, the problem with that is that anyone who thinks, right, this just shows how good Nate Diaz is and Conor McGregor... No. In that fight, you have to understand, the history of Nate Diaz still applies. Nate Diaz is not a world championship level fighter. Nate Diaz is a very good fighter, but he's a gatekeeper and has been his whole career, and for a reason. He's the guy where he's got a threshold that you must surpass. And if you can, you're a world championship fighter. If you can't, you're not. Now, in this case, it wasn't that Conor showed he wasn't a world championship fighter. Nate didn't beat Conor. Conor beat Conor. Now, Nate was there to benefit from the assist and to have the glory off that. But you saw what happened the next time around. Because part of the problem here is that a thing we have seen in Conor's career, because he's knocking people out so early, is when he has gone longer, this guy doesn't have great stamina. I mean, by the way, I'll just point this out. The reason why it's unfair to compare him to someone like Diaz like this is because very few people do have great stamina that can go 5 rounds at the pace that they want to fight normally each round at early in a fight to have their best chance of winning. Very, very few people, we're talking like a handful of people in the UFC right now have that level of stamina. In fact, I actually think that people shouldn't in general be fighting 5-round fights. I see why they do it, because by making it so that people can't really in general have the stamina to survive that long, the thinking is that you're going to open up more holes later in the fight if they don't get finished early, and therefore you're going to get more finishes, you're going to get more knockouts. I don't know if that works though, because I notice a lot of the really, really high level fighters seem to go more down the GSP approach now. Now, GSP is someone himself who's an incredible athlete and very, very fit, training all the time, and yet he's someone who, it's no coincidence when he was fighting 5-round fights, he had so many decisions in his career. But when he was fighting 3-round fights, he was incredibly exciting, dynamic, put people away. Even when he fought them in decisions, he beat the fuck out of them in their guard. There's a reason why there's 2 different GSPs, because the GSP that's a champion and knows he's fighting 5 rounds every time and against the most dangerous guys in the world, learned how to conserve his energy, how to use efficient, effective techniques that win you points, that get you through a fight, that neutralize the opponent, don't let you take too much damage yourself, and win the fight by the decision each and every time. That's the reason why he is, in terms of like point fighter, probably the best point fighter the UFC's ever seen. Just a genius in terms of that sense. And people put a lot of the blame on Greg Jackson for that. I actually think that's more how GSP wanted to fight. If you listen to the way that guy's mentality worked. So the problem is, Conor McGregor didn't have this 6 stamina, but by losing to Diaz, it brought him back to the approach he had against Siva, against Poirier. This brought him back to the patient approach. So next time he fought Diaz, he picked his shots. He didn't chase. He used leg kicks to chop away at Nate's mobility okay, it's not going to take away Nate's stamina, but it's going to slow him down a bit. He's not going to be doing as much to you. It's going to pin him a little bit, and without as much mobility, you're going to land some more as well. Now you can cut off the octagon against him. So I actually think that, in fact, what's funny is I think if you look at the way some of these really good fighters use leg kicks, it reminds me actually of how tagging works in CS 1.6, where with the first couple of bullets, you're trying to hit the guy with the AK to tag him, and that slows his movement, which then lets you set up the other bullets which kill him or finish the job for you outright. So I actually think the loss to Diaz was a key turning point. In fact, it reminds me of when LeBron, the basketball player, lost in the 2011 finals. Because after that, he was already the MVP. He was the best player in basketball. But the way he lost in the finals made him go away and say, well, first of all, he probably did have some choking issues to work with. But secondly, it made him think, even though I'm the best in basketball, is there a way I can actually improve my game? And so we know over the next 2 seasons, he started working on his low post game. He started taking less 3-pointers. And even though he was the best in basketball with amazing numbers, winning the MVP every season, he still found a way to actually increase his efficiency, to make himself more effective and impactful in the game, to bring up his percentages. And as a result, he dominated the game more, won the next 2 championships. This reminds me of that in as much as it's an all-time great person, but actually a key loss teaches them something about themselves that they had slightly off in terms of how they saw themselves, or something that's a flaw of theirs. They correct it and they're going to come back even better the next time. So I think it was a turning point in that way, especially because it brought us back to what are the true strengths of Conor McGregor, which is timing and precision. Because the key thing about him is his left hand, if he lands that, then it's going to do damage. It's maybe going to knock you out. It's not about he has to hit you with a really hard left or he has to hit you with a really fast left before you get it. No, it's not like that. It's not that sort of a punch. He just has to touch you with that thing. And if he does, the precision, the timing mean that you are going to go down. You are going to take damage. It actually reminds me of anyone who watched the Stephen Wonderboy Thompson fight when he was fighting against Woodley might have wondered why throughout the whole fight, even when Thompson had been beaten up a bunch, Woodley had to be very conservative against him and worried about his attacks. That's because Wonderboy Thompson has a fantastic kicking technique. And so because he has precision and timing, it's not about him winding up and hitting you. Like Tyron Woodley, if he goes for a punch, he's going to go for a knockout punch, but he's going to swing and he's going to wind up and you're going to see it coming a million miles away, but if it hits you, it'll knock you out because of the power and the speed. He's going to, as an athlete. Thompson is more like he's just going to flick it out there super fast. And sure, it's going fast, but the point is it's going fast, but it's not going with like the maximum power you could kick someone with. The aim, though, is to make it precision. So he's just going to land it on you, and if it hits that right area, you're going to be knocked out, and that's how he made it that fast. So Conor McGregor's punch is more like that in that sense. And especially since it's a counter punch, his left, he's wanting you to attack him so that he can time it and then get that punch, and that's how he's going to knock you out. And that's his key move. So one of the things I like about this, and one of the things that is interesting, is that he set it up this time with in the past actually, like Nate Diaz's second fight, with the kicks. Because when you set it up with kicks, that's another thing that a lot of people who are casuals don't understand in MMA. Kicks to the thigh are probably one of the most painful techniques to endure. They don't show much because there's some shorts on there and people don't understand what it's like to be kicked in the thigh. Your leg just can't stand that. It will start to fill with blood. You'll be busting it up. It will make it, it'll feel a lot heavier. It'll be harder to move around. It'll hurt to stand on that front leg. So when people keep getting hit with that kick, their reaction is, I don't want to just stand here and keep getting hit with this kick. I'm going to move forwards. I'm going to attack this guy. And in fact, if I see him go for a kick, I'm going to try and attack him, thinking that I'm going to get the jump on him and I'm going to catch him while he's doing that. So that actually draws someone in to what Conor McGregor wants anyway. It's the concept of having a move which, to counter your special move, is actually the counter to their counter. That's what he's trying to do in these fights. So one of the things I found interesting is the idea that like McGregor's going to knock everyone out isn't as interesting as if you look a few fights ago when he started talking more in the features about his philosophy, his mindset of how he thinks about fighting, and the fact that he has this obsession with movement, and it's about how can a body move and in what way. If you think about that and the way he talked about that, it makes sense as to why he's developed this fantastic precision and timing on his punch in that way. And as a result, if he takes a disciplined approach, doesn't get caught up in fighting the other person's fight, now he's in a position where he's looking for his opportunity to land that particular punch, and that's what's going to win him the fight. So I have always liked fighters in the UFC, whether they're champions or not, who understand their strengths. So as in that part of that means being humble enough to not think you're really good at something else, and then play to their strengths and style. I mean, I'll give you a good example of someone who at one point in time was a very good fighter in the UFC, and he ruined his whole style. It was a guy called Josh Koscheck, and this guy was a really good wrestler, and when he needed to, he had knockout power. But because he landed a few knockouts, he stopped wrestling people and just started trying to swing this, I think it was an overhand right, just trying to swing this overhand right to knock people out. And this eventually got him knocked out against better fighters and actually just ruined the end of his career and wasted the last few fights he had and put him in a position where he wasn't doing what he could have done. If he'd stuck with the wrestling and continued to keep that, sometimes look at people, he probably could have been a lot more effective in his career. Now, one part, obviously, that adds to the mystique of McGregor and why he's so popular, or in as much as he's got fans and he's got anti-fans. This is a key concept a lot of people don't understand. There's a big difference between having fans and haters. Conor McGregor has fans who follow him religiously, watch everything he does, obsess about him, want him to win. And he has anti-fans who follow him religiously, obsess about everything he does, and want him to lose. And that's the key difference. His anti-fan will buy the pay-per-view to watch him lose. Someone who's a hater might just be like, oh, fuck this guy, I'm just going to watch someone else in the UFC. I'm not even going to buy that pay-per-view, I don't want to watch it. That's the difference. Conor McGregor has all the fans and the anti-fans. He has insane popularity. Now, part of it isn't just his style, which is very exciting, and this kind of like chosen one type storyline that's playing out, how he's calling, how he's going to do it, and he is doing it in that way, and he's got this control over this special technique. No, part of what makes him successful is all that, but it's augmented by his shit talking, by his ability to trash talk, to rile people up, and to say things which seem legit. They don't just seem like they're scripted bullshit, but they have enough scripting to them and enough technique to them and how they're said and articulated that they're very exciting. They're delivered in the correct manner. And so in that sense, that's what's making people want to watch these fights. Now, what's interesting about this is I actually think he is, in that sense, the chosen one, because the best of all time at trash talking is Chael Sonnen. This guy was literally like, he's better than most WWE writers I've ever seen. He was fantastic the way he could come up with something. The key thing about Chael Sonnen is you could never beat him. Like if you came up with something he'd done, like failed a drug test or talk shit about Brazil, he'd find some way to spin that into trash talk so that he wins out again. He sounds like more like a badass, like a gangster. He could do that. And so the problem is, though, Chael Sonnen didn't have that exciting style of fighting. Now, if you appreciate wrestling, he had a very interesting wrestling style to shutting people down. But the problem is, I always wondered what would ever happen if Chael Sonnen won the belt, because then he could talk the ultimate shit, right? Well, the interesting thing about Gregor is we've got a guy here with trash talking like Chael Sonnen's, I think a little bit not as good, still fantastic though, and an exciting style, and he's won the belts, and he's winning these big fights over these legends. Now we're getting the ultimate spectacle of trash talking. Like that comment he made about how he apologized to no one after the fight. By the way, that was clearly pre-written before the fight, but it's baller as fuck if you win the fight and can deliver it. It's obviously going to make the story way better. It is like something out of a movie. That's why it would be written in an anime or a movie and delivered in that way, because it would have the moment is primed for something like that to come in and detonate and blow the whole thing up even further than we just saw in the fight. So one of the things that's interesting about McGregor to me is that despite it seeming like, well, he's made history and he's won these two belts, he's actually still pretty young in his career. This is a guy who, in terms of elite fights, has not had many in the UFC. I mean, you look at the best fighters he's fought, the three best fighters he has fought would be Jose Aldo, obviously it wasn't much of a fight, Eddie Alvarez, Chad Mendes, and Nate Diaz. Now, of those fighters, the only ones who were championship fighters are Aldo and Alvarez. Now, Aldo, certainly one of the greatest fighters of all time, still probably the best featherweight of all time, but that fight was very short. Now, interestingly about Alvarez is Alvarez, before he won the title, would actually have been considered at the level of Mendes, of Nate Diaz. He was like a gatekeeper type fighter in the UFC. Now, he was fantastic in Bellator, but it was lesser competition. When he came over to the UFC, he would win a couple, he'd lose the big fight that stopped him getting near the belt. He'd win a couple, lose a couple, stop. So these guys all were sort of the same. They were sort of the guys who were like the third, fourth, fifth best fighters. They're not like the one or two best fighters. That has rarely happened in their careers. And when it has, other people overtake them or they don't win from the champion. So he's fought one super elite world-class fighter. Other than that, he's fought some very good gatekeepers or like just above the gatekeepers, but not the best fighters. He's fought some elite level fighters, but not the best whole fighters in the world in that particular sense. So as a result, there are lots of challenges out there still for Conor McGregor. This story is not over. I mean, the most immediate one, the one that they should put together literally tomorrow, is Aldo. Because that was not a proper fight. Now, listen, that's not taking anything away from Conor McGregor. He did everything he needed to do. He won that fight. He won the belt. Great, you're out there. But Aldo is such a great fighter and has now got himself back in position to be the number one contender by winning that next fight, that Aldo certainly should have to have a rematch now. Not least because if Conor doesn't fight him, he should be stripped of the belt. He just hasn't fought now. You can't just go and fight 3 fights elsewhere. In fact, this would be his 4th fight outside of the division without defending his belt. At that point in time, you have to give up the belt and just be the lightweight champion. So if he wants to remain double champion, he should have to now go down and take care of business in featherweight, which means fighting Aldo. And that would be an incredible fight. Now listen, maybe Conor wins again, but I think Jose Aldo is an amazing fighter. And now that he's had that loss, I'll be very interested to see what would happen the next time they fight, because I don't think Jose Aldo would dive in the way that he did there. Jose Aldo himself often didn't used to be as aggressive in that sense. He used to be a bit more of a counter fighter during most of the fight, especially in 5-rounders, and see where you were at like in the 3rd or 4th round. So that would be a fantastic fight, and I think that should have to happen if they want him to keep both belts. He should now have to featherweight, go down to featherweight. If he can win then they let him come back up to lightweight. That's the way I think they should play it if they want to both get the big money fights and be fair to the sporting aspect of MMA. I also think that Aldo's the only obvious fight at featherweight because, unfortunately, that division is pretty shallow. I mean, Aldo admittedly has made people look bad because he's beaten so many of them, but also Conor has really beaten the other big contenders in that division, and so it is a little bit of a shallow division. So I only really want to see him go down and fight Aldo, and if he can survive that fight, go back. I mean, it doesn't matter if he loses that fight, actually, if you think about it. If he goes down and loses the fight, he's definitely going back to lightweight anyway to defend the only belt he'd have. So I would say put him versus Aldo next, and then we see from there. Now, in terms of a lightweight, unfortunately, the real fight we all still want to see, most of the hardcore fans, is Rafael dos Anjos. Problem is, not only did Rafael dos Anjos lose in the meantime, he lost twice. So he went off and lost to Tony Ferguson. So that has kind of, unfortunately, fucked up the lightweight division because Rafael dos Anjos is a monster. Sure, you can lose in MMA. That's what's amazing about MMA. You can be the best, second best fighter in the world, and you can still lose. There's still people out there who will get you, or who on that day will get the better of you. Now, I still think Rafael dos Anjos would be a fantastic fight for Conor McGregor. He would bring a lot of problems, and the way he would pressure Conor McGregor would be fucking amazing. And if he gets Conor McGregor down and starts beating him up in his guard, that is going to be nasty. So I really want to see that fight. Unfortunately, since Rafael dos Anjos has lost 2 fights now, that means he basically has to go on a 2 to 3 fight winning streak, and he has to really be winning these convincingly, emphatically, so that then he can get the hype back up that people want to see that fight resume, because at the moment it's not going to happen. Now, the one everyone's suggesting at the moment, which is one that makes a lot of sense, is Khabib, because this is a guy where, I mean, hasn't lost, he's undefeated, so that's a great storyline. He actually beat Rafael dos Anjos in the past. He is clearly a very good fighter. The problem Khabib has is he is injury prone. Now, he has seemed like he's gotten over that this year, so let's just hope it's not the case. And the key is he would be a good counter in as much as he's probably got the best wrestling in terms of MMA wrestling for takedowns in either of the divisions that Conor would be fighting. So I think that's a great one because we haven't seen wrestlers fight Conor McGregor and purely go for the wrestling aspect. That's the problem. He's fought 2 wrestlers at the moment that thought they could box with him, which is just the way that people in MMA are. They're examples of people who didn't know their style and didn't play to their style. So I actually think that that would be a fantastic fight to see, would be to see him go and fight Khabib. And I certainly think it would be interesting because it would answer a lot of questions about Conor McGregor. Now, I still think McGregor would probably win that one because I do think Khabib is not really that much of a striker and he does look a bit shaky on his feet. Like it looks like he just defends until he gets in a position where he has the shot to go for the takedown. So I actually think that would be dangerous when he's fighting against McGregor. Now, another person, obviously, because he beat Rafael dos Anjos, is Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson is a fantastic submission artist. This guy would be very interesting. His problem is he hasn't had that many elite fights. Like, his path's been very weird, and him beating Rafael dos Anjos was a bit of a shock. Like, I think they set that fight up almost assuming dos Anjos wins it, and then he's in position again to fight McGregor. So when that happened, I think Dana White was like, Jesus Christ. And so now Tony Ferguson, okay, you could put him up. My problem is I think he's like 1 or 2 fights away from really showing he should get the title shot. But maybe just because of the storyline, they could use him. That's also possible. I still think, I mean, admittedly, he's fighting in a different weight class now. I still think if he came down and he went on another little run, I think Donald Cerrone, Cowboy, would be a very fun fight because he's aggressive, but I mean, this guy, he's just an excitement fighter. So first of all, there'd be some interesting back and forth beforehand. If they fought, he's quite long and he's a kickboxer. And he's got decent boxing. He more has like MMA type boxing. It's more knockout boxing. But I think that would be a very exciting fight. Because I can see either person getting knocked out in that fight. That's what would be fun about it. And I think that's like a 2-round fight. I think that's not going to go the distance in that particular scenario. And I want to see what happens when someone who's better at kicking than Conor comes in. And now isn't just allowing himself to be kicked in the leg all the time. And therefore rush forwards like so many of them do. I mean, this is one that unfortunately won't happen. But my dream fight would be in a world where Conor goes down again to fight a featherweight. Somehow we instead get the super fight of Dominic Cruz coming up to fight Conor McGregor. Now, that would be incredible because, first of all, it'd be a super fight, so you could make a lot of money off it. Admittedly, Cruz isn't the most popular fighter, but Dominic Cruz is fucking incredible. He is an absolute unique outlier in MMA. I mean, what's funny is when you had... why do I forget all these names? I should never do these videos like 2 in the morning. It doesn't work, does it? Let's see, who am I thinking of here? Oh, that's right. So Cruz's last fight against TJ Dillashaw. What's funny is while Cruz was out with his injury, everyone said, "Oh, TJ Dillashaw is the new Dominic Cruz. Look at the way he moves. Look at the way he dives in and out and doesn't get hit a lot and uses a lot of like movement to throw the enemy off." You saw against against Cruz though. Cruz is the master of that. He's still on another level in that way. And unless you're very, very good at boxing and hitting, you're not going to be able to get close to this guy, and it's going to be super hard to take him down. So I still think if you could get that fight going, now that would be incredible, because is McGregor going to be able to hit him? Is he going to be able to tire McGregor out by having him miss so much? Also, Dominic Cruz literally fights with his hands down, because that's how incredible it is. He wants you to go for the shots so he can move, so he can feint, so he can move off it, so he can hit you on off angles. What a very interesting fight that would be. Sure, Conor McGregor could be much bigger than him by the time he's rehydrated, and I doubt Cruz goes up, quite frankly. I think he just stays in his division. And Cruz is also injury prone, so maybe they can't just line up. Maybe the stars don't align. But I would love to see that one. I think that would be a dream fight. I think that one, the real dreams for me, if they can get the fight streak together or they can get in the position to have the fight, is either, it's in this order. The Jose Aldo rematch, that has to happen in my opinion. Second of all would be Rafael dos Anjos gets back up there and we have that fight. Third of all would be Dominic Cruz does the super fight and we get that. So what's interesting about Conor McGregor is, it's not like, if you've started watching now, the story isn't over. You haven't come in too late. You haven't missed it all. Now you're in the middle. Now we're going to find out if Conor McGregor goes on to be like top 5 MMA fighter of all time, or we're going to find out whether now he does fight more elite opponents and he kicks some more losses and he has some wins and he has some losses and he's a very good fighter and he's a champion once, twice, 3 times, whatever. But he's not this like chosen one type destiny where no one will beat him from here on out and he'll continue to rise up in that particular way. That's what's going to be very interesting to see. Will he become an Anderson Silva or a GSP, or will he just become a very good fighter who has his times at the top and his times where he gets beaten and we watch him because he's entertaining and exciting, not just for the hype and the storyline? Because at the moment, no one can really know.